We're going to go ahead and get started. I think some more people might be on their way, and if they trickle in, that's fine. So, welcome back to Found in Translation. We're working to expand our understanding of biblical words, and the metaphor that I'm going to keep coming back to for that is of a mental encyclopedia. So if you missed week 1 or you need a reminder, that means upstairs everybody's got like an encyclopedic knowledge of every word in every language they know, which allows them to parse every possible meaning of that word when they're creating communication and when they're interpreting communication. So what we're doing in this class is we're working to try and help our encyclopedia line up with the encyclopedias of the people who wrote the Bible. And last week we got our first tool for doing that, which was simply to be aware of semantic range, which again is the range of possible meanings of a word, and to allow the patterns we find in the Bible itself to inform our encyclopedias. So for example, last week we looked at the word eyes, which Larry very serendipitously reiterated for us this morning. And we noticed that in the Bible, eyes seems to have this kind of negative or ominous connotation, where when we see something being right in their eyes, or seeing that something is good, unless it's God doing the seeing, is not going to end well. So that's not something that I have in English. With eyes, it's a completely neutral connotation. But when you track the patterns in the Bible, you start to realize, okay, there's something going on here that doesn't play in the English language that I need to be aware of. And I ended last week with a defense for reading the Bible in this way. I got halfway through it, so we're going to finish it this morning before we go on to our second tool for expanding our biblical encyclopedias. So we talked about biblical poetry at the end of last week. I said that the key feature of biblical poetry, you're fine, come on in, is parallelism that invites comparison. So you've got 2 or more lines of poetry that are worded the same way. You're supposed to look at them together and go, okay, these are similar but not identical. And when you notice the difference between them, that's when insight happens, that's when the light bulb goes off and you see, oh, this is what the author's really talking about. And it was my argument that that's not just going on in the poems, but that's how these people thought and wrote, and they did that across the whole Bible. So I think that the Bible was assembled by the guidance of the Spirit in such a way to invite us into these comparisons and contrasts. Or to say it another way, what we did last week is the way you are supposed to read the Bible. And the original audience would have understood that, but 2,500 years down the line, literature's changed, and we don't read literature this way in English in 2024. So this is where we ended last week, but I think this begs a question, because last week we compared Genesis and 1 Kings. If you know a lot about the Bible, you might know that those were written something like 700 years apart. And so it's a pretty big claim for me to say you're supposed to read Genesis and Kings together when there's that huge gap in time between them. To put that into perspective a little bit, the U.S. is about 250 years old. So you think about like George Washington and the Revolutionary War, the distance between now and then is like a third of the distance between Genesis and Kings. How can I say that you're supposed to read those together? I think there's 3 explanations. One is you're not, and I'm wrong. Right? Obviously, I don't think that, but that's a reasonable conclusion. Right? They're not meant to be read together. They were written centuries apart. Let me try to dissuade you from that. So the second option is we got our answer right here. God inspired the Bible. He knew that future generations were going to read it. He could have just planned it that way to where it was written in a parallel way so that future generations like us could compare it and find that insight. I think that is a completely reasonable explanation. I think it's a sufficient explanation. But I think there's a third one that's more historical, more on the human level, that it helps me kind of wrap my head around what's going on a little better. And it requires us to do, to do some close reading and a little bit of ancient history. So if you've got a Bible, open up to Deuteronomy chapter 34. While you're doing that, somebody tell me, who wrote the books of Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy? Moses. Yes, that's right. Now, these books, the first 5 books of the Bible, they're often called the Pentateuch or the Torah. And yes, historically they're attributed to Moses. But then you get to Deuteronomy 34, the last chapter in the last book of the Torah. And this is what we find. So Moses goes up on a high mountain in Moab. He's on the east side of the Jordan River, not in the Promised Land, but like on its doorstep. He's not allowed to go into the Promised Land because of the whole hitting the rock incident, if you remember. But God lets him see it. He shows him the whole Promised Land. And then after he sees it, we find this in Deuteronomy 34, verse 5. So Moses, the servant of the Lord, died there in the land of Moab, just as the Lord had said. And the Lord buried him in a valley near Beth Peor in Moab. But to this day, no one knows the exact place. You skip down to verse 10, it says, there has never been another prophet in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face. The Lord sent him to perform all the miraculous signs and wonders in the land of Egypt against Pharaoh and all his servants and his entire land. With mighty power, Moses performed terrifying acts in the sight of all Israel. So, hot take, I don't think Moses wrote that. Right? I think this is very clearly somebody much further down the line in history looking back at Moses and going, man, Moses was awesome. We've had a lot of prophets since him, but none were as good as he was. And even today, no one knows exactly where he's buried. So who is this that we're listening to, and when is today, right, that we're talking about? So here's a little ancient history for some context. You could divide up the story of the Old Testament any number of ways. This is the way that makes sense to me. I think of it as happening in basically 5 sections. So the beginning of the story, in Genesis chapters 1 through 11, is the story of all of humanity. We learn where we come from, why we're here, why we've got all these problems that we have, right? And what God is going to do about it. In Genesis 3:15, God promises there's going to be a human who will fix the problem, or what it says is a seed of the woman who will crush the head of the snake. After Genesis 11, through the rest of the Torah, the story zooms in from all of humanity to just one family, the family of Abraham. And it talks about how that blessing, the Genesis 3:15 blessing, is going to come through this family. That family grows up into an entire nation. And that nation is supposed to be an example to the rest of the world of how God and humans are supposed to relate to each other. The phrase your Bible uses is a kingdom of priests. Just like a priest is meant to be an intermediary between a group of people and God, the whole nation of Israel is meant to be an intermediary between the other nations and God. But instead of being an example to the rest of the world, Israel follows the example of the rest of the world. And for most of its history, Israel is just indistinguishable from the other Canaanite people groups around it. Larry talked about it this morning. Most Israelites, for most of their history, including those in power, worshipped Baal and Asherah and Dagon and so on. And if they worshipped Yahweh at all, it was in name only. However, there is a small group of people, a minority group within Israel, who takes the law of Moses seriously and who creates all kinds of new literature. And you could call these people the prophets, or more broadly, just the remnant. So they try to get their people back on track, but the majority of Israel doesn't pay any attention to them. Which leads eventually to them facing the consequences of their actions. They're conquered by the foreign empires of Assyria and then Babylon and led away into slavery in exile. After a couple generations in exile, some Israelites are allowed to come back to the Promised Land, and they try to restart the culture of their grandparents and great-grandparents and so on. And in hindsight, those people look back and go, those prophets were onto something, because all of the terrible stuff they predicted came true. So this group of Second Temple prophets and scholars look back and go, crap, we should have listened to Moses, we should have listened to the prophets. Let's start taking them seriously now. So they take the Torah and all of this prophetic and wisdom literature from across Israel's history, they edit it a little bit, and they compile it into a new collection, which you could call the Tanakh, or the Hebrew Scriptures, or the Old Testament. I've found a really helpful metaphor for thinking about this is to think of the Old Testament as a quilt. If you're making a quilt, you're not necessarily making every square in the quilt. Maybe one used to be a t-shirt, you took one out of a different quilt, right? Maybe you're making some yourself, right? But you are taking these different squares and you're putting them together into something new. So you might patch some up, you're choosing how they're arranged, and you're creating the connecting tissue that keeps the whole thing together. So you can think of the Old Testament as a quilt, and every book in the Old Testament as a square in that quilt. And if this is what's going on, then it makes perfect sense that somebody in the Second Temple period would take 1 Kings and Genesis and go, all right, let's make these line up so that in the collection you can compare them and get the insight that we found last week. Another way to think about this, if you spend any time on YouTube or TikTok, there's like a whole genre of videos called reaction videos. And what happens is there's an original video, and then somebody superimposed in front of that video talking about it. If you're a little bit older or you just don't spend time on those platforms, you may remember a show called Mystery Science Theater. I've never seen it, but apparently it does the same thing. What you're watching is people watching something. And when you pick up the Old Testament, that's what you're looking at. You're looking at Second Temple prophets commenting on the stories that came before them. When you get to Deuteronomy 34, you're hearing somebody from this point in the story looking way back here and going, man, Moses was awesome. I wish we had another Moses. Which is why in the New Testament, they can confidently say, Jesus can say, the Old Testament is about me. Because the Second Temple scholars realized we need that Genesis 3:15 person. And so they put the Bible together to point to that Messiah. Last week we talked about thinking of the words that we're tracking with in the patterns as hyperlinks, internet hyperlinks, right? So a word lights up for some reason. So you click on it and it takes you to a whole other wealth of information. So when we saw eyes in 1 Samuel 18, we could click on it, so to speak, and it would open up all of the terrible stuff in Judges, Genesis 3 in the fall, and you would go, oh no, right, Saul, don't do whatever it is you're thinking of doing. Another way to think of it is, if you're thinking of the quilt, to think of those words as a red thread. And going, okay, I'm tracking with this red thread that's woven through all these different squares through the whole quilt. The New Testament is a little bit different than this. It came together much faster in space of a couple centuries, which doesn't sound fast, but in terms of literature, that's pretty quick. And so all of the New Testament authors are more or less aware of each other, and they're all really familiar with the Old Testament. So you don't get so much cross commentary between the Testaments, but you do get a lot of backwards commentary where the New Testament authors are talking about insights they have about the Old Testament. All of this to say, what we did last week, I genuinely think is how you're supposed to read the Bible. I think it was put together on purpose for us to make these comparisons. Depending on whether you've heard any of this before, this is either old news and you're just waiting for me to get done, or I just blew your mind. It blew my mind when I first heard about this. But once you see it, it's all over. And all the time in the Old Testament, there's a little note that's like, hey, this is where this thing got its name, and it's still called that today. Or, yeah, that's just how they did it back then. Or this is where we get this saying that we still use, right? Once you notice this, you'll see it everywhere. But I realize that can be a big concept and a shift for people, so I'm going to pause here, see if there are questions, concerns, disagreements before I go on. Yeah.
What's your assertion about the fact that there are some New Testament authors that made references to works that are not part of the biblical canon?
Yeah.
Right, like references to the books of Enoch and things of that nature.
Yes.
What is your assertion in terms of what kind of role that should play in our understanding, or am I jumping ahead?
No, that's totally fine. So, yeah, the question of canon is a big one. As I understand it, I'm not an expert in the field, but as I understand it, the Old Testament as we have it, not in the order that we have it, but in the books that are in it, is the original canon, is the original quilt, to use that metaphor. But you have this people group who live, their nation has been going for hundreds of years. There's 400-ish years between when the quilt comes together and when Jesus is born, right? So another double U.S., so to speak, between the finished Old Testament and Jesus. People are going to write stuff. And so the New Testament authors are aware of a lot of that, and they read a lot of it, and they probably thought it was very important. I mean, clearly some of them did, because they comment on it. But did they consider it Holy Scripture? I think no. In the same way that I will quote C.S. Lewis all the time, I think he's a genius and has incredible insights into theology and Scripture and things like that, but I don't think he's the Bible. I think we're looking at the same kind of thing, where these extra biblical works are extremely important and useful, but they're a different kind of thing than the Bible itself.
Yeah.
Is that? Yeah.
I appreciate that.
Any other questions about this or comments on? Another one? Yeah.
Sorry.
No, you're fine.
So what about the idea, the books that were subsequently removed from, during the Protestant
Yes.
Reformation, there was a process where certain books, by a process that I'm sure was measured and thought out and highly considered. What about those books? Like,
Yeah.
you know,
Yes, like Maccabees and so on.
Maccabees
Yes.
and others.
So again, I'm not an expert in this, but my understanding is, in Hebrew tradition, there was a canon, which is the Old Testament, and then Christianity springs up, and you start adding these new books to their canon, which we call the New Testament, and there seems to be in the first and second centuries a consensus about what we have in our Bible, Old and New Testament. And since that time, other stuff got added to it, and the Protestant Reformation, as I understand, was an attempt to kind of go back to the source. So yes, things were removed, but they were removed from a later collection that had added things on, if that makes sense.
Okay.
And some of y'all might know more about that than I do. I might be wrong about that, but that's my understanding. We good to go on? All right, awesome. So all of that's in defense of our first tool. We're going to start talking about our second tool now, and we'll see how far we get. So I'm going to reiterate some points, and some of y'all have never been here, so this will be new for you. But remember that communication first involves taking ideas in one party's head, filtering it through your mental encyclopedia in order to create the text. And text is in quotes because that's not necessarily written word. And any communication is the text in lit theory. So that happens, and then another party has to interpret that text. I think this is important to just say out loud. That means all listening or reading is interpretation. There's no such thing as just simply hearing somebody. What you're doing right now, you are interpreting the words that I'm saying to you. When you're in really comfortable and familiar settings, it's easy and very accurate, usually. We don't need to get into that. So typically, we don't even realize that it's happening when we're in very comfortable cultural situations. When you start getting into cross-cultural situations, work of listening, your awareness of it goes way up. So let me give you a silly example of something that happened to me. I grew up in Minnesota. Some of y'all learned that this morning before class. And when I first moved to the South, I overheard a conversation about people talking about the toboggans. They were at Walmart and there was a whole wall of toboggans. And I'm going, they don't get that much snow here. Why would they need any toboggans, let alone a whole wall? Found out later they were talking about hats, what I would have considered a beanie. In my northerner encyclopedia, toboggan had a very narrow semantic range. It meant exclusively bobsled. I'm going, they don't need any bobsleds here, right? I had never heard that used to talk about a hat, right? And so, and that's just from the northern United States to the southern United States. When you start talking to people who are from like England or Australia or who don't speak English isn't their first language. They come from some other language group or country, all right? This sort of stuff goes way up. You become way more aware of it. It's happening all the time. It just breaks down the further you get from comfortable situations. So all of that's we've talked about this before. I just want to remind you all of this before we go into what we're going to go into. We're going to do a little thought experiment. I'm going to read something to you, and then I'm going to ask you to do something with it. In just a second. I forgot I had this slide. So we looked at the first week how words don't exist in isolation, but they actually exist within the context of a language. And often that context is as important or more important than the word itself. We're going to take that a step further today and say that languages don't exist in isolation either. They necessarily exist within the context of a culture. Which is why when you go from northern United States to southern United States, you start having no idea what people are talking about. So even though we speak the same language, culture was different, there was a disconnect, right? Okay, now let's do our thought experiment. I'm going to read this passage, and then I'm going to ask you to think to do something with it. February is the worst. It rains constantly, and I feel like I'm perpetually under a blanket of dark clouds. Maybe that's why I feel sleepy all the time. I get headaches, too, from the pressure. Don't ask me how I feel in February. I'll always give you the same answer. I'm under the weather. Now, I want you to imagine you're a professional translator, and you have been tasked with translating this passage into a language for a people group who live in the Nairobi Desert. They don't speak English, obviously, because you're translating. They don't use our calendar, so they don't have a February. They don't get thunderstorms, and there's nothing in their language analogous to our phrase, under the weather, meaning sick. What do you do? This is not rhetorical. What would you do?
Paraphrase it.
Paraphrase. How would you paraphrase it, Katie?
This, you want me to really?
You don't have to do it word for word. Just like what would your process be?
You would think about what's the general idea of the
Okay.
paragraph, and like, what do you want me to take home from it?
Sure. So if you do that, you're going to end up with a much less interesting paragraph. You're going to lose all the metaphor, and you're just going to get this little note about a guy who gets sick in the early month of the year. But you get the meaning across. What else could we do?
I would try to find some insight into some cultural approximations that
Okay.
they would have. Like they may not have that, but what do they have that could be most similar
Sure.
to this thing?
Okay.
And try to go that route.
So that's called localization, where you take kind of the same idea as a paraphrase, but you're trying to find something similar in their culture that you could compare it to. All right. Anything else we could do?
Well, I don't know about, it's what you do, but you have to take, why are you translating it? Are you trying to show how this particular person feels? Or are you trying to decide what a temperate climate is like throughout the year? I mean, why are you translating it?
Okay. So go not even to the source of this particular paragraph, but the source of the broader context, and say, why is this paragraph even in here? And try to communicate that. Would anyone just translate it word for word?
No.
Why not?
Well, to give you the example of an acquaintance of mine who used to be a missionary in New Zealand.
Uh-huh.
His wife was not there one Sunday morning.
Okay.
And he said to the audience, "I'm sorry, but she's under the weather."
Yeah.
Which meant,
She's sick.
no, it means
No.
she had a hangover.
Oh,
In New Zealand.
in New Zealand, that's what I did not know that.
Yeah.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Okay. So if we translated this just straight word for word, you would get some really weird implications in this hypothetical other language, right? Especially when you got here. I'm under the weather. Where else would you be? We're all under the weather. And you might draw some really weird conclusions, right? Does this guy go to space for the other 11 months? What does he mean I'm under the weather, right? So you're beginning to see, and you maybe already do if you've done anything like this before, but you're beginning to see the problem translators have translating the Bible into English, and why we just have so many translations of the Bible. What you end up with is a spectrum of translations that are all trying to do something a little bit different with the Bible. So on one end, we have paraphrase, which is what Katie wanted to do. Paraphrases of the Bible are really good at, I think, two things. One, making it easily digestible. And two, shaking up our perception of something familiar. I grew up reading the Bible, and I would wager many of you have too. So an interesting experiment can just be to grab a paraphrase Bible you've never heard of before and read a familiar passage and go, I've never thought about it like that before. It helps you see things from a new angle. What are some problems with this end of the spectrum?
You lose all the texture of the text.
Okay, yeah, like we saw with our idea, you lose the metaphor. And what if the metaphor is somehow important to a larger theme going on? Say I'm tracking with the idea of like blankets and sleepiness for some reason, and I take that out in the translation because it doesn't help me understand this guy is sick. Well, now I've lost that through line. Yeah. Did you have another thought?
In the message, when the Israelites were told in Egypt to gather things from the Egyptians, in the message it says they picked the Egyptians clean.
Okay. Now,
That's a good example of a paraphrase that not everyone would get, but
Right.
get it.
now that there's another possible pitfall with paraphrase translations, because I get with that metaphor like a vulture
Yes.
pulling meat off of a corpse, right? Which is a lot. I mean, it's violent and visceral, and I mean, Israel did did really do a number on Egypt.
Yeah.
God did. But when I read Exodus, I get the idea that the Egyptians gave them stuff, like they wanted them to have it, not like the Israelites went through and ripped their jewelry off of them, which is the image I get with picked them clean.
It's not valid.
So
So how do you deal with the word hospitality when the language doesn't have that word?
exactly.
So in Brazil, a friend of mine helping to translate into a language that had no concept of hospitality,
Okay.
translated it, be like a woman with smoke under her arms.
Okay.
Because what that means is she's preparing meals, she's preparing to help you,
Gotcha.
and she's doing it over the fire.
Over the
She has
fire.
smoke under her arms.
Sure. Okay. I would never think to word it that way, but that's because I don't speak that language.
Yeah.
Yeah, exactly. So another possible problem with paraphrase translations is, what if you're trying to do what we did last week and track with repeated words? They're not going to be there in a paraphrase. Right? All right, what about the other end of the spectrum? This is what's called formal equivalence, or just word for word. We've already looked at a potential problem with this, right? If we do the under the weather word for word, you get some weird implications, possibly. Are there any positives with this side?
It gives you room to interpret things how you would, rather than like taking someone else's interpretation.
Yeah, so you don't lose metaphors. You keep them intact. Yeah? Anything else?
It's more pure, I guess. It's since it's so word for word, it's nobody's, I don't know,
Yeah.
subjective whatever being read into. Well, what does this mean? Well, let's make it say this. It's more just like, you know.
It feels purer, yes. And if you think that the Bible is the Word of God, there's a conviction among many that you shouldn't change it. Now, you're translating it, so you are changing it, right? And just fundamentally, you are. But can we try to mitigate how much we change it? That's kind of the idea with this end of the spectrum. And then in the middle, you have what's called dynamic equivalence, which is a thought-for-thought translation, where you're not really paraphrasing, but you're trying to do word for word until it doesn't make sense, and then you do something different. So for example, as I understand it, there's no word in Hebrew for angry. What you say is, their nose got hot. And so even in formal equivalence translations, you don't find that. Well, you find something like, the anger of the Lord was kindled. Right? Literally what that says is, the nose of Yahweh got hot. Right? But that doesn't make sense in English, so they don't do that. Dynamic equivalence is a little more, leans into that a little more. Ideally, this is all of the strengths of both sides and none of the weaknesses. In my experience, it's all of the strengths and all the weaknesses. It depends on the passage. And of course, what counts as this makes sense with formal equivalence and it doesn't make sense is totally up to the translator. So here's my point. I'm not trying to say, boy, our translations stink. They don't. They're incredible. And I'm so glad we have them because I don't speak Hebrew or Greek. And I would be lost without our translations. But my point is, no translation is perfect. No translation does everything. I've heard, I kind of like this metaphor, but I've heard you can think of translations like golf clubs. I don't golf, but I know if I need to make a 5-foot putt and I grab a driver, I'm an idiot. So if you think of what is it that I'm trying to do, and then you pick a translation that's appropriate for that, you're going to have more success. And it's okay to have a favorite golf club, one that you're most comfortable with, right? But that doesn't mean you should use that club for every situation. So just for me personally, when I am doing casual reading myself, or I'm reading to like younger people or new Christians, I tend to pick something in the dynamic equivalence range, a little more on the paraphrase end. NLT is my go-to. It's easy to understand. It still keeps some of this without being confusing most of the time. When I'm trying to shake up my own understanding, like I already said, that's when I go to a paraphrase and I try to think, let me look at this from a new angle. And when I'm trying to do like intense, serious study personally, that's when I'll pick something from this end and I'll start to look at, what was this like in the original language?
This is just English.
Correct, yes. The Bible has been translated into hundreds or thousands of languages, and you got to deal with this every time. Every time.
Same thing exists in Spanish, and I ran into it.
Yep, I'm sure you did. Yeah. So this is our second tool. We're going to have to read multiple translations.
Yes.
You can't stick with one because there is no one that does anything. And that's not a fault. Sorry, there's no one that does everything. And that's not a fault of any translator. That's just the reality of how translation works. There's no such thing as a perfect translation. And when you start doing this regularly, you'll start noticing, boy, that's really different between translations. And when you do that, that is a little flag that says, hey, study me. Find out why these people took really different tracks to translating this. Katie, a couple weeks ago you said, there's just so much, how do I know what to look up? This is a great place to start. When you start seeing discrepancies between translations, that's a good sign. There's something going on in the original language that's just hard to translate. So go look. Yeah, great. Actually, we're doing great on time. So let's practice this. We're going to read one passage out of several translations, and we're going to think through it and talk through it together. This is from the Gospel of John, chapter 1 and verse 14. Justin, will you read this one for us?
And the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we have seen his glory. Glory is of the only Son from the Father, full of grace and truth. Thank you. Mitchell, will you read the NRSVA?
And the Word became flesh and lived among us, and we have seen his glory, the glory as of a Father's only Son, full of grace and truth.
Good, thank you. Both of these are from the formal equivalence end of the spectrum, but you can see even word-for-word translations aren't identical. This is from the dynamic equivalence end of the spectrum. Fred, would you mind reading that for us? Can you see it?
And so the Word became human and made his home among us. He was full of unfailing love and faithfulness. And we have seen his glory, the glory of the Father's one and only Son.
Thank you. And finally, from the paraphrase end of the spectrum, this is the Message. Marshall, can you read it?
The Word became flesh and blood and moved into the neighborhood. We saw the glory with our own eyes, the one-of-a-kind glory, like Father, like Son, generous inside and out, true from start to finish.
Thank you. So obviously I've bolded what I want to focus on, but I could have picked a lot of things here. Right? Something's going on with one and only Son, right? There's a lot of different ways that's translated. Grace and truth is generous inside and out, true from start to finish in the Message. That doesn't seem like it's the same thing to me, right? So there's a lot of things we could have picked out, but I want to focus on this. Dwelt, lived, made his home, moved into the neighborhood. And just for some context, here's the original Greek. That bold word there, that's eskenosin. That's the one word that's translated these 4 different ways across different translations. So let's talk through it. What do your encyclopedias do with the word dwell? What's that word? How do you feel about that word?
Yeah, it's where you live.
It's where you live? Would you say, I would never say I dwell on Tervada Drive.
No.
Would you?
But I do think dwelling place.
Dwelling place?
Yeah.
What about it?
Just like, I mean, there's even a song about dwelling place, but like a home.
Yeah. When do you talk about a dwelling place?
Day to day, never.
In church, okay? So this might not be true of all of you, but for me, this is a very archaic word. If I use it in church, or I use it in connection to my thoughts. I might say, I'll dwell on that. I don't talk about me personally dwelling anywhere. Maybe you do, I don't know. But for me, this is not a very personal word. What about lived?
As opposed to died.
As opposed to died?
Yeah.
Okay. Sure? Any other thoughts?
I've lived in many different cities, places where you have
Okay. Yeah.
done life.
Now, depending on the context, this could be an extremely personal word, or it could be a totally neutral word. I mean, you can live anywhere, right?
And I even find myself using it when I reference like my job. Like, this is the world that I live in.
Yes.
Personally, right? Like I live in this zone.
Right.
Of,
And maybe you hate your job.
I don't.
I know, but I'm saying you could talk about it that way. Say that, man, this is just the world we live in, right?
Right. Yeah.
And mean I don't like it,
Right. Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Like, you got to deal with it. Right.
Okay.
Yeah.
What about made his home?
Your nest.
Your nest. I like that.
So
Sunk
that's
roots.
deliberate.
More deliberate. Somebody said roots.
Something roots.
Yes.
All these words imply stay to me. It's where
Stay.
You're staying. You're
Yeah.
visiting.
Yeah.
Cousins, or you're staying.
It's more of a positive context in this one, though.
Absolutely. There's a lot less ambiguity with this one. If I'm making my home somewhere, there's intentionality to it. Somewhere doesn't just become a home on accident if you're making it your home. And if it's your home, you don't just live there. Right? So the New Living Translation translators have looked at this and said, we need to make this more personal, more intentional about what God is doing in the person of Jesus. And then moved into the neighborhood? What? No?
No.
No?
Too much.
Too much? What do you mean?
It's too folksy.
Okay. So you're pulled out of it.
I just look at
By
it.
the-
and go,
Okay. I think this is totally valid. I feel the same way a lot when I'm reading the message. I'm like, okay. That's, you're trying to be cute. Yeah. And then that actually takes me out of hearing what the scripture is trying to say. That can happen with paraphrases a lot. I'll just tell you, for me personally, I don't know my neighbors. I don't feel like this hits a lot harder for me than this one, because I've been in lots of neighborhoods in my life, and the neighborhood I don't think of as my home. But for some people, this might hit a lot harder because your neighborhood could be like, you get this community aspect to it that might not be there with just home.
But it's so non-specific.
It is non-specific. Yes. Everything is non-specific. Jay, you had your hand up.
Well, I was just like, Eugene Peterson was the guy who wrote the message.
Yes.
Who was writing it to a primarily African American community that could not understand an IV translation in particular, because
Sure.
it is so written to white middle class America in general.
Who are church literate.
Who are,
Yes.
and so for these people, they may never leave their neighborhood.
Correct.
Like ever in their entire lives.
Yep.
We drove further than they may travel in their entire life just to get to church today.
Right.
And how much more community, how much more intentionality, and how much more choice
Yep.
is it to be in that neighborhood?
Yeah.
Like generations of people in your neighborhood.
Yeah.
kind of thing. And so there's like this generational aspect to it that
Yeah.
you kind of miss in
Yes.
the other three.
Right,
Yes.
It's culturally narrow.
Yes. So again, golf clubs. Who are you talking to? What are you trying to do? Yeah? I want to end with this, and this is looking ahead to next week. The Greek word, eskenosin, means to live in a tent. None of these translations say camp. Right? And I think there's a whole lot of reasons for that. But it means in a tent. Think about Israel's history. Is there an important tent that this could be referencing? This is the tabernacle. Jesus is the new mobile temple in Israel. And even across the entire spectrum of our translations, none of us got that.
He didn't have a home,
He didn't. You're right. You're right.
did it? He moved.
He moved, yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. And he himself was a tent
Yes.
of God. Yeah. So, how did I get this? That's what we're going to do next week. Our third tool, we're going to start using scholarly resources. Specifically, we're going to look at the poster child for this class, Logos Bible Software. And I'll just give you a preview of it today. This is what it looks like. It's an interlinear tool, which means you have, if it'll load, you have the English on top, the original language underneath, and we'll, next week, this is all we're going to do. So if this is confusing as heck, don't worry about it. We'll unpack it. But it does say Kai. Yes. Yes, it does mean and in Greek. Yeah. So there it is. Dwelt, eskenosin. Here's how to pronounce it. Here's what's called the lemma, which is the most basic form of the word. We'll unpack all of that next week. But there you go. And I just want to show you all. I know we're over time, but this is so cool. You can do a Bible word study here. Here's all the times eskenosin appears in the New Testament and all the different ways that it's translated. You want to talk about filling out your Bible encyclopedia? This is how to do it. Come back next week. We're going to look at how to do this. Thank you all for coming today.